An older CEO was abandoned on a date. Then a single father asked her one simple question, and neither of them knew that question would change both of their lives before the winter was over. The waiter had already refilled her water glass twice, and the chair across from her was still empty. Outside the tall restaurant windows, the first snow of the season had started to fall over the rooftops of Denver, soft and slow, the kind of snow that made the whole city look like it was holding its breath. If you enjoy stories where kindness gets rewarded and good people finally catch a break, tap that subscribe button and hit like before we get into tonight's story, because trust me, you do not want to miss how this one ends. Winter has always felt like a season of quiet honesty to me, the kind of cold that strips away everything false and leaves only what's real underneath. And that is exactly the feeling I wanted to capture with Catherine's story tonight. So grab something warm to drink, and let's begin. Catherine Vaughn was 52 years old, and she had built Birchwood Home Goods from a single struggling storefront into a company with locations in 11 states. Her grandfather had opened that first shop after coming home from the war with nothing but a set of tools and a stubborn refusal to fail, and Catherine had grown up sweeping its floors after school before she ever imagined running the whole company one day. She had taken over full control 14 years earlier, right in the middle of the ugliest divorce of her life, when her husband walked out with the house, most of their savings, and whatever confidence she'd had left in her own judgment. She rebuilt everything from a rented office above a hardware store, closing deals worth millions without her voice ever shaking. But tonight, sitting in a black dress she had chosen with more care than she wanted to admit, she felt smaller than she had in years. She had told herself, driving downtown that evening with the first flurries hitting her windshield, that this date was simply an experiment, one more attempt to prove to herself that the cold, guarded version of her life she'd built since the divorce wasn't the only version left available to her. Her date, a man named Peter Ellison she had matched with 3 weeks earlier through an app her assistant had practically forced her to download, had texted that he was running 15 minutes late. That had been 40 minutes ago. His phone now went straight to voicemail, and Catherine kept glancing at the door with a calm, practiced face while her stomach twisted itself into knots underneath the table. She had almost canceled the date twice that afternoon, once during a budget meeting that ran 40 minutes long, and again in the elevator on her way down, when she caught her own reflection in the polished doors and wondered, not for the first time, whether she had simply gotten too used to being alone to know how to be anything else with someone new. She noticed the other tables the way lonely people always notice a room. A group of coworkers laughing too loudly near the bar, a young couple leaning into each other by the window, a waiter gliding past with a tray of champagne for someone's anniversary. Everyone around her seemed to belong to something. Catherine belonged to an empty chair and a plate of food gone cold, and she hated how much that small fact stung after everything she'd survived. She thought about leaving. She ran the math the way she ran every hard decision at work, weighing the humiliation of walking out alone against the humiliation of sitting there a little longer with a full glass of wine and an empty chair across from her. In the end, pride kept her seated 1 minute too long, and that single extra minute changed everything. That was when Thomas Bellamy walked past her table, carrying his sleeping 6-year-old daughter against his shoulder. He was 39, a carpenter who ran his own small contracting company, and he had brought Lucy to this restaurant because he had promised her months earlier, before her mother got sick, before the funeral, before his whole world folded in on itself, that when she turned 7 they would eat somewhere with a view of the whole city. He had kept that promise even though it nearly broke him to walk through the door alone with a little girl in a paper birthday crown. He kept it because some promises are the only thread holding a person together, and Thomas Bellamy was not a man who let go of threads easily, not even when every part of him wanted to cancel the reservation and stay home under a blanket instead, grieving quietly where no one could see him. He noticed Catherine the way you notice someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Her spine was too straight. Her hands were folded too neatly on the table. Her eyes kept drifting toward the door and then snapping away fast, like she was embarrassed to have looked at all. He almost kept walking, telling himself it wasn't his business, that he had enough grief of his own to carry without picking up a stranger's on a night that was already hard enough. But Lucy stirred against his shoulder and murmured something about the pretty lights outside, and in that small motion Thomas found his feet slowing down next to Catherine's table instead of carrying him past it. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if she had been stood up. He asked one simple question, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the noise of the restaurant. His voice a little rough from nerves he didn't expect to feel over something this small. "Would it be all right if my daughter and I kept you company for a few minutes?" he asked. "She's convinced tonight is some kind of magic, and honestly, I'm starting to think she might be right." Catherine looked up at the tired kindness on his face, at the sleeping child in the paper crown, at a stranger who had somehow noticed her pain without ever naming it. And for a moment, she couldn't find her voice at all. She said yes before she even finished deciding to say it. Thomas eased Lucy gently into the empty chair, and the little girl blinked awake just long enough to study Catherine with wide, serious eyes and ask if she was a princess, since her dress was as black as the night sky and her earrings sparkled like tiny stars. Catherine laughed, a real laugh, the first one she'd had in weeks, and told Lucy she supposed she was a very tired princess who'd had a long day at her castle, which was really just a big office building downtown with terrible coffee. Lucy found this endlessly funny, and Thomas found himself smiling for the first time since the funeral, watching his daughter chatter away with a woman she had known for exactly 90 seconds like they were old friends catching up on years of gossip. Snow kept drifting past the tall windows behind them, gathering quietly along the sills, and the whole restaurant somehow felt warmer for it, warmer than a room full of strangers had any right to feel on a night this cold. They ended up sharing the table for the rest of the night. Thomas apologized, half joking, that he hoped he wasn't crashing someone's plans, and Catherine, surprising even herself, told him the truth. She admitted she'd been waiting on a date who clearly wasn't coming, that she felt foolish sitting there in her nice dress with a full glass of wine, and that she had almost left before he ever walked by her table at all. Thomas didn't offer her pity, and she was grateful for that. He simply said the man was a fool, stated it plainly, the way you'd mention the weather, and then he changed the subject entirely, asking what kind of work let a woman command a restaurant table with that much quiet authority even while sitting alone. She told him about Birchwood, about the storefront her grandfather opened decades ago, about clawing it back from near bankruptcy after her marriage ended and everyone assumed she'd sell. He told her about the carpentry business he'd built with his own hands, about losing his wife Anna to cancer 9 months earlier, about learning to braid his daughter's hair from shaky videos online at 1 in the morning because there was no one left to ask. He said it plainly too, without asking for sympathy, the way people talk when grief has become simply a fact of their days rather than a fresh wound they're still bleeding from every hour. Catherine found herself listening in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in years, not performing patience, not waiting for her turn to talk, just listening because this stranger's honesty had quietly cracked open a door inside her that she'd kept locked since her divorce, a door she had genuinely believed was rusted shut for good by now. Lucy fell asleep again somewhere around dessert, her cheek resting on a folded napkin, and Thomas and Catherine kept talking long after the other tables had emptied into the cold, bright night beyond the glass. They talked about the specific loneliness that comes with being good at your job, about how you can fill a calendar with meetings and still come home to complete silence every single night. Thomas talked about the terror of raising a daughter alone, of being both mother and father some mornings without knowing how he'd get out of bed, and doing it anyway, because a little girl needed her lunch packed and someone to promise her every single day that things would be okay eventually. Before they left, Thomas asked for her number, not smoothly, more like a man who was badly out of practice and a little afraid of being turned down after everything he'd already lost that year. Catherine gave it to him without hesitating, something she wouldn't have believed herself capable of 3 hours earlier. As they walked toward the door together, snow swirling under the streetlights outside, Lucy woke just long enough to slip her small hand into Catherine's, and Catherine felt her eyes fill with tears she didn't bother hiding anymore. In the weeks that followed, what started as an accidental kindness slowly became something neither of them had expected. Thomas called, not with big gestures, but with small steady ones, a check-in after a hard day, a photo of Lucy's newest drawing, a simple thinking of you text sent at odd hours of the night when he couldn't sleep. Catherine found herself rearranging her calendar around coffee before board meetings, something the old version of her would have called reckless and the new version of her quietly called the smartest decision she'd made in years. She met Lucy again properly one Saturday at a park near Thomas's house and spent 2 hours being taught the correct way to push a swing by a 6-year-old who took the responsibility very seriously, correcting Catherine's technique twice with the stern authority of someone much older. Snow dusted the swing set and the bare tree branches overhead, and Catherine realized she hadn't spent an afternoon just playing, with no phone in her hand, and longer than she could actually remember. Halfway through that afternoon, Lucy climbed into Catherine's lap uninvited and asked quietly if her mommy could see her from wherever she was now, and whether she'd be mad that Lucy liked spending time with someone new. Catherine felt her chest tighten, and instead of brushing the question aside, she pulled Lucy a little closer and told her that mommies who love their children usually want them to keep being happy, no matter who helps make that happen, and that liking someone new didn't erase anyone she'd already lost. Lucy considered this seriously for a moment, the way only small children can, then nodded and asked if Catherine wanted to see her draw a horse. And just like that, the heavy moment passed, though Thomas caught Catherine's eye over his daughter's head with an expression of quiet gratitude that told her he'd heard every word. A few weeks after that, Thomas invited her to dinner at his own house for the first time, a small ranch place on the edge of town with a crooked mailbox he kept meaning to fix and never had time for. Lucy insisted on setting the table herself, carefully placing a paper napkin folded into a triangle at every seat, and announced proudly that Catherine was allowed to sit in Mommy's old chair now because Daddy said it was okay, a comment that made Thomas go quiet for a moment before he nodded and said it was more than okay with him. After dinner, Thomas pulled a scarred workbench out of the garage and tried to teach Catherine how to sand down a small wooden birdhouse Lucy was building for a school project, laughing at how carefully Catherine measured every stroke like she was closing a merger instead of smoothing a piece of pine. "You run a company with 1,100 employees and you're terrified of a sanding block," he teased, and Catherine threw a handful of sawdust at him in response, something she hadn't done to anyone since she was younger than Lucy was now. Later that night, after Lucy had fallen asleep with sawdust still in her hair, Thomas and Catherine sat on the back porch wrapped in the same blanket, watching their breath fog in the cold air while a few stray snowflakes drifted down early for the season. "I forgot what this felt like," Catherine admitted quietly, "just sitting somewhere with nowhere else I needed to be." Thomas didn't say anything clever back. He just reached over and laced his fingers through hers, and they stayed like that until the cold finally chased them both back inside. Around that same time, Lucy's teacher mentioned to Thomas at pickup one afternoon that Lucy had drawn a family picture for a classroom project and included a woman in a black dress standing beside him, labeling her simply as Catherine, "my dad's friend who found us at the restaurant," a detail that made the teacher smile and made Thomas quietly proud in a way he didn't fully expect walking out to his truck that day. It wasn't a fairy tale arriving all at once, either. Thomas's grief still ambushed him without warning some nights, and there were evenings he called Catherine just to sit quietly on the phone because he couldn't find words for what he was missing, and she never once tried to fill that silence with something easier to hear. Catherine had her own walls, built brick by brick over a marriage that had ended in betrayal. Walls she had once told Teresa she planned to keep standing for the rest of her life, because trusting anyone that completely again simply wasn't worth the risk anymore, and she didn't lower them easily or all at once. Thomas never asked her to. He simply kept showing up, kept asking questions instead of making demands, and slowly, the way trust always builds, not in leaps but in small repeated proofs, Catherine let him further inside her guarded life than she had let anyone in a decade. She noticed, too, that her own frozen edges seemed to be softening the same way the hard ground softens under a fresh layer of snow, quietly and without announcement, until one morning you look outside and the whole yard looks different than it did the night before. Her assistant Teresa Combs, who had watched Catherine survive her divorce with gritted teeth and back-to-back meetings, was the first to notice the change in her boss, and simply said one afternoon that it was good to see her smiling at her phone again instead of frowning at spreadsheets. 2 months into whatever this new thing between them was becoming, Thomas's small company, Bellamy Contracting, submitted a bid to renovate the flagship Birchwood home goods store downtown, a project Catherine had championed personally as a way to modernize the brand her grandfather started without losing the character that made it special. Thomas hadn't asked her for the job, and in fact had almost pulled his bid entirely once he realized how it might look to outsiders. But his numbers were the strongest of the 4 contractors who applied, and the facility's director recommended him without knowing anything about their relationship at all. That recommendation landed on the desk of Bradley Whitcomb, the vice chairman of Birchwood's board, a man who had spent 2 years quietly building support to sell the entire company to a larger competitor called Larkspur Retail Group, a sale that would have made him personally wealthy and stripped nearly 1,000 employees of the family culture Catherine's grandfather had spent a lifetime building. Bradley had never liked Catherine's refusal to sell, and now he finally had something he thought he could use against her. He called an emergency session of the board without telling Catherine what it was about, and when she walked into the room, she found 5 members already seated, folders open in front of them, faces carefully arranged into neutral expressions that fooled no one who had spent as many years in boardrooms as she had. Bradley stood at the head of the table, tapping a folder against his palm like a man about to enjoy himself immensely. "We need to talk about a serious conflict of interest," he said, sliding photographs across the table. Pictures of Catherine and Thomas at the restaurant that first night, pictures from the park, even one from the coffee shop near her office taken through a long lens. "You awarded a renovation contract to a man you are personally involved with," Bradley said flatly, "and several board members are concerned that your judgment on this project, and frankly on this company, is compromised beyond repair." Catherine felt her face go hot, but she kept her voice level, the same voice she'd used to negotiate contracts worth 10 times what Bradley Whitcomb was personally worth. "Thomas Bellamy submitted the strongest bid of 4 contractors, evaluated independently by our facilities team before I ever saw a single number," she said, "and I am happy to have that entire process audited by anyone in this room, starting today if you'd like." Bradley smiled thinly. "Convenient timing, though, isn't it," he said, "that the strongest bid happened to come from a man you were photographed holding hands with 3 weeks earlier." Catherine opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, the senior member of the board, an 80-year-old woman named Constance Ray, who rarely spoke in meetings, but whose opinion carried enormous weight, finally looked up from her own folder. "I've reviewed the bid numbers myself this morning," Constance said quietly, "and Mr. Bellamy's proposal saves this company nearly $200,000 over the next closest bid, using better materials with a faster timeline. If that's a conflict of interest, Bradley, I would very much like to see more of them brought before this board." The room went still, and for the first time since the meeting started, Bradley's confident expression cracked just slightly at the edges before he covered it with a cough. The vote that afternoon went in Catherine's favor, 4-2, keeping both her leadership and the renovation contract intact, and keeping Bradley's proposed sale to Larkspur off the table entirely for now. Catherine walked out of that meeting believing she had won, that the storm had passed as quickly as it arrived. She called Thomas that night to tell him everything, laughing with relief for the first time in days, and Thomas listened with the particular quiet of a man who wanted badly to believe good things could simply stay good once you'd fought for them properly. But snow that falls softly in the evening can turn to ice by morning, and 2 weeks later Catherine's phone would not stop ringing. A local news website had published a story claiming that Bellamy Contracting had used substandard materials on a previous job, a senior living facility on the east side of Denver, and that elderly residents there were now at risk because of shoddy, unsafe construction work that had somehow slipped past inspection. The article included what looked like internal inspection documents, stamped and signed, showing failed safety checks that Thomas had supposedly ignored to save money on materials and labor. Thomas's phone exploded with cancellation calls within hours, 3 long-standing clients pulling contracts they had held with him for years, and a local news van actually parked outside his house that evening while Lucy watched from the window, confused and scared by the commotion outside her own front door. A reporter named Wendy Marsh knocked on Thomas's front door that same evening, microphone already in hand, asking him on camera whether he wanted to comment on allegations that his company had endangered elderly residents to cut costs. Thomas stood in his doorway with Lucy peeking out from behind his legs, and for a moment he said nothing at all, his jaw tight, before he finally spoke. "I passed every inspection on that building myself," he said, "and I would like to see the original paperwork before anyone airs a single word of this story, because whatever those documents show, it is not true." Wendy pressed him again, asking if he had any explanation for the failed safety documents already circulating online, and Thomas simply repeated, calmly but firmly, that he stood behind every piece of work his company had ever done and that he intended to prove it. The clip aired anyway that night, cut down to a few seconds that made him look evasive instead of honest, and Lucy asked him at bedtime why the lady on television said Daddy hurt people, a question that gutted him more than anything Bradley Whitcomb had done so far. Thomas showed up at Catherine's office that night, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw real fear on his face instead of quiet grief. "I never touched those support beams," he said, pacing in front of her desk, running both hands through his hair over and over. "I passed every single inspection on that building myself. I was there for every one of them. Catherine, I genuinely do not understand where these documents came from or who would do this to me." Catherine pulled up the article on her computer and studied the inspection stamp carefully, something nagging at the back of her mind. A familiar signature style she couldn't quite place at first glance. Then it hit her. The stamp belonged to a city inspector named Vernon Holt, a man whose brother, as it turned out after one phone call from Teresa the next morning, happened to work directly under Bradley Whitcomb at a separate real estate holding company Bradley quietly controlled outside of Birchwood entirely. That same week, Thomas had to sit down with his youngest employee, a 24-year-old apprentice named Danny whose girlfriend was 7 months pregnant, and explained that he could no longer afford to keep him on payroll with 3 clients gone and no new contracts coming in. "I'm sorry, Danny," Thomas said, unable to look up from the invoice folder in his hands. "I don't have work to give you right now, and I won't keep paying you out of money that isn't coming in anymore." Danny didn't argue or raise his voice. He just sat down slowly across from Thomas, rubbing his tired eyes, and asked quietly if he thought any of this would blow over soon, because the baby was due in 10 weeks and the apartment they'd found needed a deposit he no longer had saved. Thomas, unable to promise something he didn't believe himself in that moment, simply reached across the desk and gripped Danny's shoulder and said he was going to fight this as hard as he possibly could, and that the second there was work again, Danny's name would be the first one he called. Catherine happened to be at Thomas's small office that afternoon dropping off paperwork when she overheard that conversation through the thin wall, and watching this exhausted man apologize to a scared young father for a lie that had nothing to do with either of them cracked something loose in her that all her boardroom battles never had. She had spent her whole career protecting a company built from her grandfather's hands, but this felt like a different kind of fight entirely, one she intended to win no matter what it personally cost her. Catherine called Vernon Holt's office the next morning and requested the original, unedited inspection files under a public records request, refusing to accept the version that had somehow found its way to a reporter before it ever reached Thomas or the building's actual owners. It took 3 tense days of phone calls and follow-ups, during which Thomas lost one more client and had to quietly turn down a job he badly needed just to avoid further scrutiny while the story was still spreading online. Teresa stayed late at the office 3 nights in a row helping Catherine cross-reference public business filings, eventually pulling up the ownership records for the holding company Vernon Holt's brother worked for and sliding the printout across the desk without a word. "You've been running yourself into the ground for a man you've known for months," Teresa said gently, not unkindly, and Catherine admitted, maybe for the first time out loud, that it no longer felt like 4 months at all, that it felt like the first honest thing in her life in over a decade. On the 4th day, the original files finally arrived, and they told a completely different story than the one published online days earlier. Every inspection Thomas had completed on that senior living facility had passed cleanly, no failed checks, no ignored warnings, nothing but a contractor doing careful, honest work exactly the way he'd claimed all along. The documents used in the news article had been altered, the failing marks added digitally after the fact, and the timestamp metadata, buried deep in the file properties, showed the edits had been made from a computer registered to Bradley Whitcomb's holding company 2 days before the article was published. Catherine now had everything she needed to clear Thomas publicly and expose Bradley in the same motion. But that same week, snow came down harder than it had all season, blanketing the whole city in white, and Thomas showed up at her door looking like a man who had already made up his mind about something painful he didn't want to say out loud. "I think I need to step back for a while," he said quietly, standing on her porch in the falling snow, not quite meeting her eyes, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "You're about to fight the biggest battle of your career, and I'm the reason it started," he said. Every day we stay together. This gets worse for you, for your company, for everyone who works there because of what your grandfather built with his own two hands. Maybe the kindest thing I can do right now is disappear before I cost you everything you've spent your whole life protecting, he continued, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. Catherine stood in her doorway with the cold air pressing against her, watching snow settle in his hair, and for one long, terrible moment, she genuinely believed he might turn and walk away for good, back down the path toward his truck. Then she stepped out onto the porch without even grabbing a coat, snow immediately catching in her hair the way it had that first night at the restaurant. "You didn't start this, Bradley did," she said, her voice shaking but sure of every word. "I have spent 10 years alone protecting a company because I was too scared to let anyone close enough to hurt me again, and I am not going to let that same old fear talk me into losing the first thing that's ever made the cold feel bearable to me. If you walk away now, you're not protecting me," she added, stepping closer. "You're just proving Bradley right. That fear wins and good people disappear quietly so cowards can keep what they stole." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something breaking loose behind his eyes, snow gathering on both their shoulders in the porch light, and finally stepped back inside out of the falling snow instead of away from her for good. 2 days later, Catherine called an emergency board meeting of her own, and this time she brought Thomas with her, along with a folder of her own containing the original inspection files, the metadata records, and a printed timeline connecting every altered document back to a single computer inside Bradley's separate company. Bradley started the meeting confidently, repeating his conflict of interest argument to the room one more time, until Catherine calmly placed her folder on the table. "Explain to this board why your own company's servers generated the falsified safety reports used to destroy an innocent man's business," Catherine said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. The room went completely silent, every eye turning toward Bradley, whose face began draining of color even before Constance Ray reached across the table and picked up the metadata printout for herself. Constance read the timestamp aloud to the room, slow and deliberate, letting every board member absorb exactly what it meant before she spoke again. "This isn't a conflict of interest," she said finally, setting the paper down with a soft, final click against the table. "This is fraud, orchestrated by a member of this board to manipulate a company sale for his own personal profit, and I move that Mr. Whitcomb be removed from this board effective immediately, without severance." Bradley tried to argue, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, insisting the files could have been planted, that anyone could have accessed those servers, that this was clearly some kind of setup arranged by Catherine and her contractor boyfriend to distract from her own compromised judgment. Thomas, sitting quietly beside Catherine until that moment, finally spoke, his voice even and controlled despite everything the last 3 weeks had cost him. "I lost 3 clients and had to lay off an employee with a baby on the way because of what you did," Thomas said, looking directly at Bradley for the first time. "My daughter asked me why a reporter said I hurt people. So no, I don't feel much need to set anyone up, Mr. Whitcomb. The truth already did that for me." The room stayed silent after that, and 2 board members who had quietly supported Bradley for years wouldn't even meet his eyes anymore, studying the table in front of them instead. The vote passed unanimously except for Bradley's own single vote, and within the hour, security was escorting him out of the building while reporters who had gathered outside, tipped off by Teresa earlier that morning, captured the entire humiliating walk on camera for the evening news. The same news outlet that had run the original false story ran a full correction 3 days later, along with an interview with Thomas explaining exactly what had happened to his business and why, restoring his reputation more thoroughly than anyone could have hoped for just a week earlier. Clients called Thomas back within days, several offering him even larger projects than before, apologetic and eager to make amends for doubting him so quickly without asking questions first. Danny got his job back with a raise that Thomas insisted on paying out of his own pocket before the new contracts even landed, and he showed up at the office the next morning with a card from his girlfriend thanking Thomas for never giving up on either of them during the worst month of their lives. He hung that card above his workbench, and it was still there months later, a little curled at the corners from sawdust and time. Birchwood Home Goods, meanwhile, saw a wave of public support once the full story broke. customers posting online about supporting a company whose CEO had stood by an honest, hard-working man against corporate corruption instead of quietly protecting her own image behind lawyers. Foot traffic at the downtown flagship store rose that month for the first time in 2 years, and Teresa printed out a stack of the Kinder comments and left them on Catherine's desk without a word, because some weeks a person needs proof that doing the right thing actually mattered to someone. Constance Ray, who rarely gave interviews of any kind, agreed to speak briefly with a local business paper about the board's decision, and when asked why she'd sided so firmly with Catherine that day, she simply said that she had spent 40 years watching good companies get run by frightened people, and that Catherine Vaughn had never once been frightened of doing the right thing, only of getting hurt again, and there was a difference worth protecting. 6 months after that snowy night in the restaurant, Catherine stood in her kitchen watching Thomas help Lucy frost cupcakes for a school project, flour dusted across his forearms, Lucy narrating the entire process with the seriousness of a surgeon performing open-heart surgery on the kitchen counter. Catherine realized she was smiling without meaning to, the particular smile that comes when your whole chest feels warm and you can't quite remember the last time it felt this way before now. She thought about that first night at the restaurant, about how close she'd come to leaving before Thomas ever walked past her table, about how one small, unasked for kindness had quietly rerouted the entire rest of her life in ways she never could have predicted that evening. She thought about the worst moment of that evening, sitting abandoned and humiliated under those golden restaurant lights, and how it had somehow become the exact moment everything good in her life finally began to take shape. The same way the harshest frost of winter always seems to arrive right before the first thaw. Outside the window, the season's last big snowfall drifted gently over the yard, and Catherine understood something then that she tried later to put into words for anyone who would listen, that the people who show up for you aren't always the ones you expected, and the nights that break your heart aren't always the ones that end it for good. Sometimes the person who rescues you isn't chasing anything from you at all. Sometimes he's simply a tired father carrying his sleeping daughter past your table, noticing your pain without ever naming it, and choosing, in a world that so often teaches us to look away, to stop and ask one simple, generous question instead of walking on by. On the first real snowfall of the following winter, almost exactly 1 year after that night at the restaurant, Thomas asked Catherine to meet him at the same window table, claiming he needed to discuss a new contract with her facilities team. When she arrived, Lucy was already there in a slightly bigger paper crown than the one she'd worn the year before, grinning so widely she could barely hold still in her chair. Thomas stood as Catherine approached the table, and instead of a contract folder, he held out a small velvet box, snow drifting past the same windows behind him that had witnessed the whole thing begin. "I know this is a strange place to do this," he said, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him before, "but I figured since this table already changed my life once, it might as well do it again properly this time." Catherine, who had negotiated $100 million acquisitions without a single tremble in her voice, found she couldn't speak at all for a moment, and simply nodded through tears while Lucy clapped so hard she nearly knocked over her water glass, shouting that she always knew this table was magic, just like she'd said the very first night. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you that kindness still finds the people who need it most, take a second to like this video and leave a comment about the part that touched you most. Share it with someone who might need this story tonight, and make sure you're subscribed to Winter Veil so you never miss the next one when it comes. Before you go, tell me honestly in the comments, would you have stayed in that restaurant chair that long, or would you have already been out the door before Thomas ever had the chance to walk by?